She found his boot prints in the snow on a Tuesday morning in March, and that was how Letitia Shelton learned she had never once been alone. The tracks began at the tree line, 30 yards from her front door, pressed deep into the last stubborn crust of winter snow. They circled the barn, crossed to the well, moved along the fence line where 3 boards had been replaced sometime in the night, and then they simply stopped at the edge of the property, pointing south toward the open plain, as if the man who made them had simply dissolved into the gray morning air. Letitia stood in her doorway with her shawl pulled tight, her breath coming in fast white clouds, and she felt something rise in her chest that she could not immediately name. It was not fear. She had spent 5 months alone on the Kansas plains learning what fear felt like, and this was not it. This was something rawer and more complicated, a feeling she had nearly forgotten existed. She pressed her fingers to one of the boot prints. The edges were sharp. He had been here less than 2 hours ago. She looked up at the horizon and saw nothing, only the brown grass beginning to push through the melting snow, only the vast indifferent sky of early spring, only the absence of every human being she had ever depended on. Then she saw the name scratched into the top rail of the fence post, not carved with a knife and not written in ink. Just scratched gently with a nail or a rock, the letters barely there, as if the person making them had been afraid of being too loud even in silence. G. Bristol. The name hit her like a physical blow. She grabbed the fence post with both hands and stood there, her knuckles going white, her mind spinning back and back and back through the entire frozen darkness of the winter she had just survived, reordering every strange and quiet mercy that had kept her alive. The cord of wood that appeared on her porch in November when her supply had been down to 3 days' worth, stacked so neatly it looked like something from a picture book. The wolf carcass she found 50 feet from the chicken coop one morning in December, shot cleanly through the head, the threat neutralized before it ever reached her flock. The patched hole in the south wall of the barn that she had assumed the wind filled in with drifted ice and assumed wrong. The bucket of grain left beside the horse trough when her own sacks ran low. The single broken hinge on the root cellar door that she had been meaning to fix for 2 months, fixed one morning while she slept. G. Bristol. Gilbert Bristol. She said the name aloud, and the wind took it immediately, scattering it across the prairie like something too fragile to hold onto. She had known him for exactly 1 afternoon. It was October, 19 days after she buried her husband Thomas in the field behind the house where he had wanted to be buried, 3 weeks after the fever took him, and left her alone on 160 acres of unbroken Kansas grassland with a failing vegetable garden, an aging horse named Copper, 6 chickens, a milk cow named Ruth, and a winter coming in like something with teeth. She had driven the wagon into Caldwell to sell 3 bolts of cloth Thomas had bought for a project he never got to finish. She needed the money for lamp oil and salt pork and flour. She needed those things or she would not survive February. That calculation was not dramatic. It was arithmetic. She had been loading the supplies into the wagon bed when the argument started. 2 men at the end of the street, voices rising, and then the crack of a pistol shot that made every horse on the street flinch and sent 3 women running for doorways. Letitia did not run. She stood beside her wagon and watched with the flat, exhausted practicality of someone who had already spent the worst of her fear on something that mattered more. One of the men was on the ground. The other was gone. And then a third man was crouching beside the one who had fallen, pressing a folded cloth to the wound in his shoulder, speaking quietly, and when he looked up and met Letitia's eyes across the street, something happened in the space between them that she immediately refused to dignify. He was tall, broad through the shoulders, with the particular quality of stillness that certain men develop when they have spent a great deal of time alone in open country. He had dark hair going gray at the temples, a jaw that needed a razor, and eyes the color of the sky just before weather arrived. He was maybe 35, maybe older. He wore the clothes of a working man and the expression of someone who had seen enough of the world to stop being surprised by most of it. He held her gaze for a long moment. Then he went back to the man bleeding in the street. Letitia drove home. She told herself that was the end of it. She had no room in her life for something as impractical as the particular thudding awareness that a stranger's eyes could apparently produce in her chest. She had a homestead to hold and a winter to get through and a husband 3 weeks in the ground. And she was 28 years old and utterly alone. And the only thing that was going to save her was relentless practical focus on the business of survival. That was what she told herself. She did not expect to see him again. He appeared at her fence line 4 days later. She had been out checking on copper when she saw him riding a brown roan along the road that ran past her property, moving at an unhurried pace, and she had watched with her hand shielding her eyes from the afternoon glare. He slowed when he reached her gate. He did not stop. He looked at the homestead the way a man looks at a map, cataloging, assessing, and then he rode on south and disappeared around the long bend toward the creek. She did not think much of it. Riders used that road regularly. She thought more of it 2 days later when she saw him again, this time sitting his horse at the edge of the tree line to the east, just sitting there in the late afternoon, motionless, watching the sky come down into colors of orange and red behind the house. He was far enough that she could not see his face, close enough that she recognized the set of his shoulders. She went inside and did not go back out. A week after that, she found the first cord of wood. Letitia stood now in the cold March morning with her hand on the fence post where his name was scratched, and she understood with a clarity that was almost painful that Gilbert Bristol had camped somewhere in the trees and fields around her homestead for the entire winter, and had kept her alive, and had never once knocked on her door to announce it. The question that rose in her was not whether to be grateful. Gratitude came immediately and without effort, so complete it nearly knocked her sideways. The question was something darker and more complicated, something that had to do with the fact that he had been there, 30 yards away, alone in the cold with a fire he probably did not dare build too high for fear of being seen, watching over a woman who did not know she was being watched, and he had chosen to be hidden. He had chosen the distance. He had chosen silence over connection, and she needed to understand why, because the answer to that question was the answer to a great many other questions she had not yet admitted she was asking. She looked south toward the open plain where his tracks ended. Then she went inside, put on her warmest coat, saddled Copper, and rode after him. The ground was a mixture of mud and ice, the prairie going through its uncertain early spring thaw, and she picked up his trail without much difficulty. He was riding south but angling west, which meant he was moving toward the stage road, and the stage road meant Caldwell. She kept Copper at a steady trot and watched the horizon and tried to sort out what she was going to say when she found him. She tried 3 different opening sentences and discarded all of them. She found him 2 miles out, stopped beside a creek crossing, watering his roan. He heard Copper's hooves on the frozen ground and he turned before she reached him, and when he saw who it was, something moved across his face that he controlled almost immediately. Almost. She had enough of a second to catch it, and what she caught was something between relief and despair, which was not the combination she expected. She pulled up at the creek bank and looked down at him from the saddle and said, "Your name is scratched into my fence post." Gilbert Bristol looked at her for a moment. Then he said, "I did not mean for you to find that." "What did you mean for me to find?" "Nothing," he said. "I was going to ride on in the morning, He stopped. He looked at the water moving under the ice at the edges of the creek. "I needed to leave something, I do not know why." "You were there all winter," she said. It was not a question. He met her eyes and said, "Yes." "Why?" He was quiet for long enough that she thought he was not going to answer. Then he said, "You were alone, and you did not know how alone you were, and I could not." He stopped again. He pulled the roan back from the water and turned the horse so he was facing her more fully, and she could see in his face the careful work of a man who had spent a very long time keeping things locked away. "I passed your place in October. I saw the fresh grave. I saw the wood supply. I knew what was coming. I told myself it was none of my business, and I rode 20 miles south and I set up camp and I sat there for 3 days and I could not stop thinking about whether you had enough wood to get through January. Letitia looked at him. So you came back. I came back. And you stayed. I stayed. She sat with that for a moment. The wind came across the prairie and moved through the dead grass at the creek bank and ruffled the hem of her coat. A red-tailed hawk turned slow circles high up against the pale blue sky. You fixed my barn wall, she said. The wind was going to push through by December. You shot the wolf. It was circling the chicken coop 2 nights running. You stacked that wood. You had maybe 6 days left. She pressed her lips together. You could have knocked on the door. He looked at her steadily. I know. Why didn't you? The silence that followed was the longest yet. She could see him deciding something, going back and forth between truth and the safer version of truth, and then something in him seemed to settle and he said, because I was not certain I deserved to. She had not expected that. She had expected something practical, something about not wanting to frighten a widow alone on a homestead, something about respecting her privacy or her grief. She had not expected the raw edge in those words, the flavor of a man who had spent a very long time at war with his own right to exist in proximity to good people. She said, "What does that mean?" He shook his head, not in refusal exactly, but in the way of someone indicating that the answer is long and the moment is not yet right for it. "It means I have a history that makes me cautious about what I take for myself, including simple things, including knocking on a door." She studied him for a long moment. The morning light was getting stronger, and it caught the gray in his hair and the lines at the corners of his eyes, and she thought that whatever his history was, it had used him hard. She thought also that whatever his history was, he had spent 5 months sleeping in the cold at the edge of a stranger's property to keep her safe, and those two facts together made a picture she could not look away from. She said, "Ride back with me." His expression shifted. "Beg your pardon. You have been living in the cold for 5 months on my account. The least I can do is feed you a proper breakfast. Ride back with me." He opened his mouth, and she could see the refusal forming, all the careful reasons why he should continue south and let her continue her life without the complication of whatever he represented. She said, "Gilbert Bristol, do not argue with me. I have been through too much of a winter for this conversation." He looked at her for another moment. Then slowly something in his face changed. Something that had been held tight for a very long time seemed to loosen by one careful degree. He said, "All right." They rode back together without speaking much, which should have been awkward and was not. The prairie was coming alive around them in the early spring way, subtle and stubborn. Shoots of green pushing through the gray-brown grass. A meadowlark calling somewhere to the west. The sky a pale and strengthening blue. Letitia was aware of him at the edge of her vision. The easy way he sat the horse. The contained quality of his movement. The fact that he was genuinely large in the way that men who work outdoors develop. Not the showy kind of large, but the functional kind. The kind that comes from years of physical work under open skies. She was also aware, with an honesty she could not quite suppress, that she had not been this close to another living person in 5 months, and that the awareness of his proximity was doing something to the careful numbness she had built around herself as a survival mechanism. She let herself feel it, because she was a practical woman and denial cost energy she could not afford. Then she set it aside for later, because she was a practical woman and there was breakfast to make. Her homestead looked different with him in it. That was the first thing she noticed when they rode into the yard. The same barn, the same house, the same mud-and-ice yard with the wood stacked on the porch. And yet the scale of everything shifted slightly when he dismounted and led his roan to the water trough beside Copper, and they stood together. The 2 horses drinking companionably, steam rising from the water in the cool morning air. It was a small domestic scene, 2 horses at a trough, and it hit Letitia somewhere low in the chest with unexpected force. She went inside to start the fire in the stove. He came to the door and knocked. The sound was so ordinary and so freighted that she had to turn away from it for a moment before she said, "Come in." He came inside and took off his hat and held it in both hands in the way men did when they were not sure of their welcome. She put the skillet on the stove and started cutting the salt pork she had left from her last trip to town, and she said without looking at him, "Sit down. Stop standing there like you are waiting for permission to exist in a room." A sound that might have been a short laugh, then the scrape of the chair against the plank floor. She cooked. He sat. The fire in the stove ticked and popped as it came up to temperature. Outside, the wind was picking up slightly, the last gasp of winter not quite willing to concede, and the familiar sounds of the homestead moving around them were companionable in a way that she found both comforting and terrifying. She put the food on the table and sat across from him and they ate, and after a while he said, "This is good." "It is salt pork and eggs," she said. "It is not complicated." "I have not had a cooked meal in a while," he said, and the simplicity of that statement, the absence of self-pity in it, settled over her like something heavy. She said, "Where did you sleep?" He seemed to consider whether to answer. Then, "There is a stand of cottonwoods along the creek to the east. I built a lean-to in there in November when it was clear I was going to be staying a while. Got it banked well enough to hold some heat." "A lean-to," she said. "It was adequate." "For 5 months of Kansas winter. I have slept in worse." She believed him, and that was the thing that made her set down her fork and look at him directly. "Who are you, Gilbert Bristol? Where do you come from and where were you going before you stopped outside my property in October?" He held her gaze. She could see the internal negotiation happening, the same careful weighing she had noticed at the creek. He was a man who measured what he gave very precisely, not out of dishonesty, but out of the particular caution of someone who had learned that giving too much of yourself too quickly was how you ended up stripped to the bone. He said, "I came up from Texas. I had a situation there that needed ending and I ended it, and then I had no particular reason to stay. I was drifting north. No destination. I had been drifting since '82. It was now the winter of 1886 into 1887. She did the arithmetic. 4 years, she said. 4 years. What happened in '82? The silence was long enough that she thought again he would not answer. But then he said, "I had a ranch, not large, about 60 acres east of San Antonio. I had a partner, a man named Cruz, and we ran cattle together for 7 years. He took the money we had been saving. He took it all and he left, and he told certain people that I had cheated him, because he needed someone to blame for the debts he was running up, and I was convenient. The people he told had the kind of influence that makes truth irrelevant. I lost the ranch to debts I did not owe. I contested it and lost. I could have stayed and kept contesting, but the only way that ended was badly, so I left." Letitia listened to this without interrupting. When he was done she said, "And Cruz, gone. I do not know where he is, and I have made my peace with not looking." "That is a greater peace than most men would manage," she said. He looked at his plate. "It is not greater. It is practical. Chasing him would have cost me everything I had left, including—" He stopped. "Including what?" He looked up. "Including the capacity to ever be anything other than a man chasing an old wound." She sat back in her chair and looked at him across the table in the morning light coming through the window, and she felt something shift in her understanding of him, a deep reorganization of the picture she was building. He was not a drifter in the careless sense of the word. He was a man who had made a choice to remain functional in the aftermath of a betrayal that would have destroyed many others, and that choice had cost him something, had cost him the ability to root himself anywhere, because roots required trust, and trust had been used against him in the most direct way possible. She understood that. She understood the shape of it from the inside, though her own loss had come from death rather than treachery, which was its own particular kind of wound. She said, "Thomas, my husband, he came out here from Missouri in '83. He had a plan for this land. He was going to run wheat and keep a small herd, and we were going to be something. We had 5 acres of wheat in when he got sick. The fever came in September and he was gone in 3 weeks. She said this without the tremor in her voice that it had carried for the first months. He was 31 years old. He was the most determined man I have ever known, and it did not matter at all. Gilbert was very quiet across the table. He said, "I am sorry. You lost a dream too," she said. "Yours was just done to you by a person instead of by chance." Something moved in his expression. "I had not thought of it that way." "Which part?" "That mine was worse," he said. "I have always assumed that grief from betrayal is less legitimate than grief from loss, that I had no right to it." "That," Letitia said, "is the most foolish thing you have said so far." It surprised a genuine laugh out of him, brief and rusty, as if it had not been used in a very long time, and the sound of it did something unreasonable to the interior of her chest. She looked away out the window at the yard where the two horses stood together at the trough. She said, "What are your plans now?" "I was going to ride north, maybe to Dodge City, find work." "What kind of work?" "Whatever needs doing. I am good with horses. I can break land. I know enough about cattle to be useful." She was quiet for a moment. Outside, the wind moved through the yard, and in the barn she could hear Ruth the milk cow shifting her weight. She was aware of the particular arithmetic of her situation with a precision she had been doing since October. 160 acres, 1 woman, an aging horse, a cow, 6 chickens, 5 acres of wheat that needed planting again in the spring, a fence line that stretched further than one pair of hands could maintain well, a summer coming that would require twice the labor she was capable of providing alone. She said, "I need help this spring. Real help. I cannot pay wages worth speaking of, but I can offer room and board and 10% of whatever the wheat brings in the fall." She watched him very carefully. She watched for the calculation, for the quick male assessment of what a woman alone might be offering beyond the stated terms, the thing she had been watchful for since Thomas died. What she saw instead was a kind of careful pain. He said, "Mrs. Shelton." "Letitia," she said, "if you have been sleeping in a lean-to on my account for 5 months, I think you have earned the right to use my given name." "Letitia," he said, and the way he said it, as if he was handling something he was not sure he was allowed to have, "I need you to understand that I would not, that my intentions in helping you over the winter were not aimed at—" "I know," she said quietly. "If they had been, you would have knocked on the door in October." He looked at her. She looked back. The morning light moved between them, and the fire in the stove ticked steadily, and somewhere outside the meadowlark called again. He said, "I would need to sleep in the barn." "I would expect nothing less," she said, "and I would need you to understand that I am not a permanent fixture. I do not know yet how to be one of those." "I understand that too," she said. "I am asking for a season, not a lifetime." He nodded slowly. "All right," he said for the second time that morning. She said, "You can start by fixing the hinge on the root cellar door. I know you know where it is." He looked at her with an expression that was not quite a smile but was something in that territory. "You noticed that." "I noticed all of it," she said. "I just did not know what to do with it until today." He went to fix the hinge. She cleared the breakfast dishes and stood at the window watching him cross the yard, the easy, purposeful way he moved, and she felt the enormous and somewhat terrifying realness of what had just happened settle around her. She had invited a drifter to stay, a man she had spoken to for the first time this morning, though she had known him, in a way, since the first cord of wood appeared on her porch. She pressed her palm flat against the cool glass of the window. It was going to be complicated. Everything worth having was complicated. She was 28 years old, recently widowed, holding a piece of land together with determination and very little else, and the man crossing her yard was 35 and broken in specific ways that matched her own brokenness in specific ways, like two damaged pieces of a puzzle that still fit together if you turned them right. She was practical enough to recognize that this was dangerous. She was honest enough to admit she did not care. Spring came in like a slow-gathering promise. The snow finished its retreat in the first week of April, leaving behind soft, dark earth that smelled of renewal and potential. Letitia and Gilbert fell into a working rhythm that felt, to both of them, both natural and charged. the way a guitar string feels natural, stretched tight between its pegs and charged with the potential of sound. He was in the barn every morning before she rose, tending Copper and Ruth and the chickens, and by the time she had the stove going and the coffee on, he was at the door knocking in the particular pattern of 3 knocks that she had already come to recognize, the way she recognized the sound of her own breathing. He ate breakfast with her every morning, and they talked through the day's work, and then they worked it, side by side or in different parts of the property, and they met again in the evenings. He was a careful and thorough worker. He moved through physical labor with the efficiency of someone who had spent years learning to make every effort count. He broke the south field in 4 days with the borrowed plow and Copper, working from sunup to sundown in a methodical back and forth that left the dark earth turned and breathing. He repaired the fence line along the north edge of the property, where the posts had shifted in the winter freeze. He rehung the barn door properly on new hardware from town. He diagnosed a problem with the drainage around the well that would have caused trouble by July and fixed it in a single afternoon. And through all of this he was, without being in any way diminished by it, profoundly considerate of her autonomy. He made no decisions without consulting her. He offered opinions when asked, and only then. He treated her land and her household and her choices with a respect that she found, given her limited experience of men doing such things, almost startling. There was one afternoon in mid-April when the question of what to do with the East Acre came up, whether to put it to vegetables or leave it in grass for the cow, and they were standing in the field having a genuine disagreement about it, her arguing for the vegetable garden and him arguing for the grazing. And somewhere in the middle of the argument she realized they were both fully engaged, fully present, pushing back against each other with the confidence of equals. And she felt a warmth spread through her that had nothing to do with the April sun and everything to do with the experience of being taken seriously. She made him see reason about the vegetable garden. He admitted she was right and did not sulk about it. She planted the East Acre in potatoes and carrots and onions, and he built a rabbit fence around it without being asked. She liked him enormously. She was aware of liking him the way you are aware of warmth from a good fire, present and welcome, and something you arrange yourself toward without quite admitting you are doing it. She was also beginning to feel things that went beyond liking, and those were harder to manage. He touched her accidentally twice in the first month. The first time was when she was reaching for a jar on the high shelf in the kitchen, and he came up beside her to get it down for her, and his hand came over hers on the shelf, and he pulled it back immediately as if he had touched a stove. She felt the brief contact for the rest of the afternoon. The second time was at the fence line when she lost her balance on the uneven ground, and his hand caught her elbow to steady her, sure and quick, and he held it for 1 second past the moment she was stable. 1 second only. Then he let go and looked out at the horizon, and she looked at the ground, and neither of them mentioned it. May arrived, bringing with it the particular urgency of planting season. The wheat went in over 3 hard days of work, Letitia driving the seed wagon while Gilbert walked the rows with the planting drill, both of them working from first light until they could not see the rows clearly in the dusk. She brought lunch to the field in a pail, and they sat together in the dirt with their backs against the wagon wheel, eating cornbread and cold salt pork, too tired to be careful about proximity, shoulders nearly touching. He said on the second day of planting, "Tell me about Thomas." She looked at him sideways. "Why?" "Because this was his plan," Gilbert said, "and you are carrying it forward." "I think it helps to know what someone was aiming at." She thought about that. Then she said, "He was from a farming family in Missouri, 4th of 7 children. The land went to the eldest and Thomas got nothing, but he never once complained about that. He said the frontier was opportunity for a man who was willing to work for it, and he believed that down to his bones. He was not a romantic about it. He understood it would be hard. He just thought hard was fine as long as it was heading somewhere." "It was heading somewhere," Gilbert said, looking out at the field they had planted. "Yes," she said, "it was." He was quiet for a moment, then, "He sounds like a man worth knowing." "He was," she said. "He was also not always easy to live with. He had a temper when things went wrong, and he went silent for days sometimes when the worry got too heavy. But he was honest and he was trying his best, and I loved him." "I know," Gilbert said simply. He did not offer any false comfort about grief or time or healing. He just acknowledged what she had said, and that acknowledgement, plain and clean, was more comforting than elaborate sympathy would have been. She found herself telling him more. Over the next several weeks, in the evenings when the day's work was done, and they sat on the porch in the warm May dusk with their coffee cooling in their cups, she told him about Thomas and about their first 2 years on the homestead, the disasters and the small triumphs, the neighbor disputes and the negotiations with creditors, the summer of '85 when the wheat came in better than expected, and Thomas had walked every row of it with his hand running over the tops of the stalks, not speaking, just touching it. She had known then how much it meant to him. She had known what was at stake and what the loss of it would cost her. And Gilbert listened. He listened in the way of someone with genuine interest and genuine respect, not waiting for his turn to speak, but actually taking in what she was offering. He asked questions that showed he had been paying attention not just to the words, but to what was underneath them. He was, she realized one evening with a jolt of recognition, possibly the best listener she had ever encountered, which made a particular kind of sense for a man who had spent years in his own company with no one else to listen to. He told her more too, in that same incremental, careful way, more about Cruz and the betrayal. About the years before Texas, growing up in Tennessee, the son of a schoolteacher and a farmer, the fifth child, enough land for none of them. About coming west at 20 with $30 and an optimism that had taken 7 years to build something real and 2 months to lose to a man he had trusted. "The worst part," he said one evening in late May, the sky going purple above them, "was not the money, not even the ranch. It was learning what it felt like to have your judgment that wrong about a person. I thought I knew him, 7 years, and I was entirely wrong. That is the real loss," she said, "the confidence in your own reading of people." "Yes," he looked at her. "I have not trusted my reading of a person since, not until he stopped." "Until," she said. He looked away from her out at the darkening plain. "You are easy to read," he said. "Not in the sense of simple, in the sense of honest. You say what you mean. You do not have a hidden layer with something else moving under it." "Is that rare?" she asked, though she suspected she knew the answer. "In my experience," he said, "yes." She looked at his profile in the evening light, the strong line of jaw, the gray at his temples, the way he held himself even at rest with the quiet preparedness of someone who has lived in uncertain country for a long time. She felt the pull of him with a clarity that was no longer possible to pretend was something else. She said, "Gilbert." He turned to look at her. She said, "What would it take for you to trust your reading of a person again?" He held her gaze for a long moment. The evening sounds moved around them, the calls of the last birds, the wind in the new grass, Ruth moving in the barn. He said very quietly, "I am beginning to find out." She held that. She let it rest between them without pushing further, because she was a practical woman, and she understood that the things most worth having were the things you did not grab at. And also because she was genuinely moved in a way that felt different from the breathless, chaotic kind of feeling she had expected, softer and deeper and more certain, like the difference between the surface of a river and the current beneath it. She said, "Good night, Gilbert." He said, "Good night, Letitia." And the way he said her name was different from the first time, less careful, more natural, more like someone using a word they had come to belong to rather than one they were borrowing. June came in with heat and thunder, and the wheat growing fast in the field, and something else was growing between them that neither of them had named yet, but that was present in every shared morning, every working afternoon, every evening conversation, as real as the crops in the earth. The first real crisis came on a Thursday in mid-June, when a man named Harlan Cade rode into the yard with 2 other riders at mid-morning. Letitia had seen Cade twice before. He owned the adjacent property to the west, 800 acres, a real cattle operation, and he had made an offer on her land in November, 3 weeks after Thomas died, which she had declined so firmly that she hoped she had not had to repeat it. She had apparently needed to. Cade was a heavy-set man in his mid-40s with the florid confidence of someone accustomed to getting what he wanted through the sheer weight of his resources. He tipped his hat at her in the yard, but his eyes went immediately to Gilbert, who had come out of the barn and was standing with his arms loose at his sides, watching. Cade said, "Mrs. Shelton, see you have taken on some help." "I have," Letitia said. "Good idea for a woman alone. Still, though, one man with a 1-year lease is not the same as a real operation with the equipment and the hands to run it properly." He smiled. The smile did not reach his eyes. "My offer stands. $800 for the 160. That is fair money." "I told you in November," Letitia said. "This land is not for sale." "Come winter again," Cade said. "You are going to wish you had been more practical." "I survived last winter," Letitia said. "I will survive the next one." Cade's gaze went back to Gilbert. The two of them held eye contact for a moment that Letitia watched carefully. There was something in Cade's expression as he looked at Gilbert, a particular assessment, a man taking the measure of another man and reaching a conclusion. He said, "Your man there, he is Bristol, is he not? Gilbert Bristol out of San Antonio." Letitia felt something go cold in the center of her chest. Gilbert said calmly, "I am." "Heard of you," Cade said, and his tone made it clear that what he had heard was not flattering. "Heard you lost your ranch down in Bixar County owing to some accounting troubles. Heard there were some questions about where certain funds went." It was a lie. Letitia knew from Gilbert's own account that it was Cruz's lie, the lie spread to cover the betrayal. But it was the kind of lie that stuck to a man the way tar stuck to a road, and Cade knew that, and Cade was deploying it with the precision of someone who had prepared it. She said, before Gilbert could respond, "I know Gilbert Bristol's history in full, Mr. Cade. I also know how to read the difference between a man's character and a rival's slander. What you have just attempted is not a recommendation for your offer." Cade looked at her with something that was not quite anger and not quite respect but was in the territory of both. He said, "You are a stubborn woman, Mrs. Shelton." "Yes," she said, "I am. Good day to you." Cade looked at Gilbert once more. Then he tipped his hat again and rode out with his 2 men. When they were gone, Letitia turned to find Gilbert looking at her with an expression she had not seen on him before. It took her a moment to identify it. She said, "Don't look at me like that." "Like what?" he said, his voice not quite steady. "Like you did not expect to be defended." He looked away. He put his hand on the barn door and stood there a moment with his back to her, and she could see in the set of his shoulders something that was happening inside him, something working through him that needed a moment to settle. He said, his voice controlled, he was right that there were questions. "After Cruz left, the people he owed money to circulated a story. It followed me out of Texas." "I know," she said. "You told me. You believed me." "I believed you in March," she said. "I believed you before you even told me. Some things are apparent." He turned then, and what was on his face was not quite the same as the man who had ridden onto her property. It was something more open, something with less armor in it, and it was, she thought, the face of a man beginning to allow himself to believe something he had decided a long time ago he could not have. She said, "Also, Harlan Cade is not going to bully me off my own land. I want to be clear about that." "I believe you," he said. "Good, now help me check the wheat. I want to see how it came through last night's storm." The wheat had come through well. They walked the rows together in the summer heat, Gilbert noting the growth patterns and the color with the trained eye of a former rancher who knew his way around crops, and Letitia felt, in the unremarkable ordinariness of it, a happiness that snuck up on her and caught her entirely off guard. This simple, ordinary thing, walking a field with a person who was paying attention to the same things she was paying attention to, both of them caring about the same patch of earth for the same reasons. The uncomplicated partnership of it was something she had not expected to feel again. She stopped in the middle of a row and looked at the sky and breathed, and Gilbert stopped beside her and waited, and she said without planning to, "I am glad you came back in March." He said, "So am I." The summer deepened. July came with its suffocating heat and its violent afternoon thunderstorms and its relentless urgency. They worked the property hard, maintaining the wheat, tending the vegetable garden, managing the cattle fence along the southern edge where the ground had heaved in the spring and weakened the posts. Letitia made 2 trips to Caldwell for supplies, and Gilbert came with her the second time, and she was aware, in the town, of the way people looked at them together, the inventory that small-town eyes took of a young widow and a drifter side by side on a wagon seat. She did not care, specifically. She had never been a person who organized her behavior around other people's calculations. What she cared about was the truth of the thing, and the truth was that their relationship was exactly what it appeared to be on the outside, a working arrangement built on mutual respect, and also exactly what it did not appear to be on the outside, which was something much more complicated and tender and growing steadily toward a question that neither of them had yet asked directly. A neighbor woman named Mrs. Clara Fenton, who ran a small boarding house in Caldwell, and who had known Thomas and Letitia from their first year on the homestead, stopped Letitia outside the dry goods store while Gilbert was inside and said, without preamble, "You look better than you have in a year." "It is the fresh air," Letitia said. Clara Fenton looked at her with the knowing eyes of a woman who had lived a great deal of life and saw through most of the standard explanations. "He seems like a good man," she said. "He is," Letitia said. "Is he staying?" Letitia looked down the street and then at Mrs. Fenton. "I do not know," she said honestly. "Then perhaps," Mrs. Fenton said, with the directness of a woman in her 60s who had stopped wasting time on indirection, "you should find out." Gilbert came out of the store with a bag of flour under each arm and a packet of nails in his coat pocket, and his hat pushed back on his head, and he stopped when he saw the 2 women and he said, "Mrs. Fenton," in polite acknowledgement because Letitia had introduced them on a previous visit. Clara Fenton looked at him with those frank assessing eyes, and then she looked at Letitia and said, "Good afternoon," with a small smile that contained more commentary than most speeches. On the wagon ride home, Letitia thought about the question. She was thinking about it still when they unloaded the supplies into the house in the late afternoon, and she was thinking about it when she made supper, and she was thinking about it all through the meal, and finally, when the dishes were done and the evening light was coming golden through the kitchen window, she said, "Gilbert." He looked up from the harness he was mending at the table. She sat down across from him. She said, "I am going to ask you something directly because I find that directness saves a great deal of time and grief." He set the harness down. "All right. Are you going to leave in the fall?" He was quiet for a moment. Then, "I told you I would stay through the harvest." "That is not what I asked." He looked at her. She looked at him. The evening light moved between them and the house was very quiet, and this was, she knew, one of those moments that turned on what happened next, one of those moments that the rest of things arranged themselves around. He said, "Letitia, what I am able to offer you is not, I am not asking about what you are able to offer," she said. "I am asking what you want, just that. What do you want?" He was still for a long time. She could see the cost of the answer, see him doing the internal work of setting down the armor that had kept him functional for 4 years of wandering. She watched and waited and did not push because some things could not be rushed. He said finally, "I want to stay," she breathed. "Then stay." "It is not simple," he said. There is a history that follows me. Kay demonstrated that. There will be other men who know what Cruz said about me. There will be Gilbert," she said. "I know your history, I know the shape of you. I'm not asking you to be a man without a past. I'm asking you to be a man with a future, on this land, with me." She paused. "If that is something you want." He looked at her across the table in the fading golden light. His face was open in a way she had not seen it be, all the careful layering stripped away, and what was underneath was not weakness but something more durable and more frightening to contemplate than strength, which was need. Simply and exactly that, the need of a person who has been alone for too long, encountering the possibility of not being alone anymore. He said, "Letitia Shelton, I am in love with you." She felt the words land in her with the particular resonance of something true. Not surprising, not unexpected, but true in the way that facts are true, self-evident and solid. She said, "I know, I am in love with you too. I have been for a while, and it did not seem responsible to say it until I knew you were planning to stay." Something happened in his face that she thought might be the closest she had seen him come to tears, though what came out instead was a short, breathless sound that was mostly laugh and partly something else. She reached across the table and put her hand over his. His hand was large and rough from the summer's work and warm under her palm. He turned it over and held hers. They sat like that for a long moment, two people who had both been through the particular furnace of loss, holding each other's hands across a kitchen table as the light went out of the sky. He said, "I want to do this properly." "What does that mean to you?" she asked. "It means I want to court you," he said, "in the actual formal sense of the word, with proper time and proper intention." And eventually he stopped. "Eventually," she prompted gently. "I would like eventually to ask you to marry me if you were willing. I would ask now, but it is too soon and I know it, and I want you to I want you to be certain." She pressed his hand. "I am already certain," she said. "But I think the courtship is a lovely idea." He laughed, properly this time, genuine and full and warm, and it was different from all the previous laughs because it was not surprised out of him or accidental but chosen, free, the laugh of a man who has allowed himself the luxury of happiness. She laughed too. She had not heard herself laugh like that in a very long time. They did court each other, in the full-bodied traditional sense of the word, the Kansas summer moving around them as backdrop to a romance that was both new and, in its bones, already old, already known, built from the months of watching and being watched, and the months of working side by side, and the gradual fearless accumulation of knowing each other. He brought her wildflowers one Sunday morning, a clutch of the prairie flowers she had noticed him noticing that she liked, black-eyed Susans and prairie clover, and the small yellow ones that came up thick along the creek. He held them out to her at the door with the slight self-conscious gravity of a very large man performing a delicate act, and she took them with both hands and found she could not speak for a moment. She made him a shirt from cloth she had in the house, blue cotton, because she had noticed he wore his only shirt until it gave out, and then replaced it with whatever was cheapest at the dry goods store. And she gave it to him on a Wednesday evening, folded on the table, and walked out of the kitchen before he opened it, because she was absurdly moved by the act of making something for a specific person. He wore it the next morning and did not mention it, and they both knew everything that mattered about the exchange. He kissed her for the first time on a July evening after a storm had passed through and left the world washed clean and silver green in its wake. They were standing at the fence looking at the wheat, checking for storm damage, and she turned to say something to him and found him closer than she expected, and the thing she said got lost somewhere before it reached words, and he put his hand along her jaw very gently in the way of someone handling something valuable, and she stopped breathing for a moment, and then he kissed her, soft and careful and unhurried, and she kissed him back. When they stepped apart, he looked at her with that open, vulnerable expression that still undid her every time. She said, "I have been waiting for that since March." He said, "I have been waiting for that since October." She said, "That is 5 extra months you owe me." He laughed and she laughed, and they stood together at the fence in the clean aftermath of the storm, while the last light moved golden across the soaked and gleaming earth. Harvest came in August with the particular intensity of a frontier harvest, every hand needed, every day of good weather a gift not to be wasted. Gilbert organized the harvest with the efficiency of his ranching years, and they worked from sunup until they physically could not continue, day after day. And at the end of it, the wheat was in and threshed, and the count was better than Letitia had hoped. Not a fortune, but enough to cover the debts and resupply for winter, and have a small amount left over, which was all Thomas had ever asked for in the first 5 acres, enough to keep going. She stood in the barn with the harvest tallied and the ledger showing black ink for the first time since Thomas died, and she felt the tears come before she could stop them, not grief tears but relief tears. The release of a breath held too long, and Gilbert came up beside her and put his arm around her shoulders, and she leaned into him without ceremony, and he held her, solid and warm, while she cried briefly and completely. He said quietly, "He would have been pleased." She said, "Yes, he would have." She straightened up and found her handkerchief and looked at the numbers in the ledger again. "All right," she said. "We have a lot of work to do before winter." He said, "We do." He paused. "Letitia, there is something I want to ask you before the weather turns." She turned to face him fully. He was standing very straight, and his expression had the gravity of a man who has thought about a thing for a long time and has arrived at the moment of saying it. "Gilbert Bristol," she said, "if you are about to ask me to marry you, the answer is yes." Something lit up behind his eyes. He said, "I was going to work up to it." "I know," she said. "I saved you the work." He took her hands in both of his, and he looked at her with the full, unguarded weight of everything he was, all of it present and offered, and he said, "Will you marry me, Letitia?" "Yes," she said, clear and simple and certain. "Yes, I will." He brought her close and held her there in the barn in the smell of cut wheat and turned earth, and she put her head against his chest and heard his heart going and felt the solidity of him and the particular peace that came from having found, after loss and uncertainty and one very long and lonely winter, the thing you did not know you were looking for. They were married in October of 1887, exactly 1 year from the month he had first stopped at her fence line and looked at the grave and the dwindling woodpile and ridden 20 miles south and come back. The ceremony was small, performed by the circuit preacher in Caldwell, with Clara Fenton and her husband Bert as witnesses, and a small gathering of neighbors who had known Thomas and who looked at Gilbert with the careful evaluating eyes of people taking the measure of the man who had come to hold a friend's place, and who seemed, over the course of the small reception in the Fenton parlor, to arrive at a favorable verdict. Letitia wore her second-best dress, the dark blue one with the white collar, because her best dress had been her wedding dress with Thomas, and she could not bring herself to wear it and could not bring herself to alter it. And that seemed right, the acknowledgement that the past was past and this was its own thing. Gilbert wore the blue shirt she had made him, and a coat he had bought in Caldwell with some of his share of the wheat money, and he stood at the front of the small room with the particular look of a man who cannot quite believe the facts of the moment he is inhabiting, a look she found she loved without reservation. They exchanged their vows simply and without flourish, the words of the 1880s Kansas ceremony, plain and solid, and when the preacher said the thing was done, Gilbert looked at her, and she looked at him, and they were married. Clara Fenton cried. Bert Fenton shook Gilbert's hand with the gruff heartiness of a man who was also somewhat moved, but was not going to admit it. On the ride home on the wagon in the October afternoon, the same kind of October afternoon in which he had first ridden past her property a year ago, they were quiet for a while with the comfortable ease of two people who had already said most of what needed to be said. The prairie was going golden around them, and the air had the cool, sharp quality of early autumn, and the sky was that particular deep blue of October. She said, "I have been thinking." "About what?" he said. "About the south field. Thomas had always talked about eventually putting in fruit trees along the south edge, apples and maybe some plum. It would take years to bear, but eventually we would have apples," he said. "Yes." He was quiet for a moment, then, "I think we should plant them in the spring." The word was ordinary and unremarkable, and she felt it in her chest like a struck bell. "We should," she said. He put his hand over hers on the wagon seat, and she turned her hand over and held his, and they rode home like that in the October light. Winter came, this winter with a different quality than the last, not because it was less demanding. Kansas winters were what they were, but because it was shared. Gilbert moved into the house with the plain practicality of a man who had been sleeping in a barn for 6 months, and was not going to be sentimental about the upgrade. and the house reorganized itself around two people in the natural way of houses that have been waiting for exactly this. He had little in the way of possessions. A bedroll, a change of clothes, a shaving kit, a battered book of Robert Burns's poetry that had been his mother's, a serviceable pistol that he kept cleaned and oiled. These things distributed themselves through the house, and Letitia felt the particular pleasure of a space becoming genuinely shared, the small archaeology of another person's habits and tastes becoming familiar. She learned that he read late, the book propped on the pillow beside her, the lamp turned low. She learned that he woke before dawn with the immediate full alertness of someone who had spent years in circumstances where sleeping past trouble was not an option. She learned that he was a better cook than he had ever let on, apparently having spent 4 years cooking for himself over campfires and having developed genuine skill at it. She learned that he had a dry and quiet humor that operated at a frequency she had taken some months to tune into, but that, once she had it, made her laugh regularly. He learned her too, her particular ferocity about the vegetable garden, her habit of talking through problems while she worked, not expecting response necessarily, but needing the sound of her own reasoning out loud. Her fondness for the poetry she read in the evenings, not Burns. She was not a Burns person, but the American women poets she had discovered in a collection she had bought second-hand in Caldwell before the first winter. Her stubbornness, which he had already known about and which he seemed, in the manner of someone who recognized the trait from the inside, to respect rather than chafe against. Cade came back in November. He came alone this time, which was either a concession to the changed circumstances or a strategic choice, and he was polite in a slightly diminished way, the way a man is polite when the leverage he expected to have has evaporated. He made another offer for the land. It was marginally better than the previous one. Letitia and Gilbert were both in the yard when he came. She declined the offer. Gilbert said nothing, merely stood with his arms crossed and watched, and Cade seemed to receive the full meaning of the scene, two people standing on their own land with the absolute shared intention of keeping it, and he rode off without making the veiled threats of the previous visit. She did not expect him back. The winter of 1887 into 1888 was long and cold and beautiful in the way that shared things are beautiful, even difficult shared things, perhaps especially those. The homestead held. They held each other. She told him in January, on a quiet Sunday morning over breakfast, with the snow coming down outside in the thick silent way that meant several inches before it stopped. She told him matter-of-factly, because she was constitutionally incapable of telling even the most extraordinary things any other way, and she watched his face while she told him. What crossed his face in the space of about 5 seconds was one of the most remarkable sequences of expression she had ever witnessed. Shock, then something very like terror, then a dawning joy so complete and unguarded that it actually undid her composure for a moment. He put both hands flat on the table and said, "You are certain?" "Women generally are," she said, which made him look both abashed and delighted simultaneously. He got up from the table and came around to her and crouched down beside her chair and took her hands in both of his and looked at her with everything he had, completely undefended, absolutely present. He said, "Letitia." "I know," she said. I do not know what I am going to do. I'm not sure I know how to." "You will learn," she said. "The same way you learned everything else. One day at a time." He pressed his forehead to her hands and was silent for a moment. She could feel the emotion moving through him. She put her free hand on the back of his head. He said, muffled, "I did not think I was going to have this." "I know," she said. "Neither did I." Outside, the snow came down in its thick, silent, beautiful way, covering the yard and the fence and the fields and the tree line where a lean-to in the cottonwoods had gotten them to this specific morning. Spring came again, the apple trees going in along the south fence in April, small and optimistic, staked carefully against the Kansas wind, and the wheat going in again in the west field, and the vegetable garden expanded this year to account for additional need, and the homestead growing and prospering in the way of things that are tended by people who care about them for the right reasons. Their son was born in August of 1888 on a hot, still morning after a labor that was hard and long, and that Gilbert spent entirely within earshot, which Letitia had not expected and which moved her beyond articulation. Clara Fenton served as midwife, competent and calm, and at the end of it there was a boy, solid and loud about the fact, with dark hair and what would eventually be his mother's eyes. Gilbert held him with the careful exactness of a very strong man, handling the most fragile thing he has ever been trusted with, and he looked at Letitia over the baby's head with an expression that combined profound tenderness with the utter terrified wonder of a man meeting his own son for the first time. And she thought that whatever had brought them here, whatever the cost and the loss and the long winter and the convergence of two broken people on one piece of Kansas land, it had been precisely and completely worth it. They named him Thomas Gilbert Bristol. Thomas for the man who had cleared this land and dreamed over it and given his last years to it, and Gilbert for the man who had come to carry it forward. And between those two names, the child arrived into a world that held both grief and joy and had room for all of it. Harlan Cade sold his property west of them in 1889 to a large cattle outfit from Colorado, which was actually better for Letitia and Gilbert than Cade had been, the new operation having no designs on their land and being, if anything, useful neighbors in the matter of shared fence maintenance. The apple trees survived their first 2 winters, a small miracle, and by 1890 they were tall enough that you could almost believe in the fruit that was coming, still years away but coming, as reliable as time itself. Their second child, a daughter they named Clara Ruth, came in the spring of 1891, loud and opinionated from the first hour, the combination of Letitia's stubbornness and Gilbert's quiet humor already visible in the set of her mouth. Thomas, who was 3, regarded his new sister with the philosophical wariness of a small person encountering a large and ambiguous change in his situation. By summer, they were inseparable. The wheat operation was a genuine enterprise by 1891, expanded to 40 acres, with hired help during harvest, and the homestead was something you would not have imagined from the original 160 acres of raw Kansas grassland Thomas Shelton had first broken. There was a proper vegetable cellar, a larger barn, a second water trough, a chicken coop expanded twice to accommodate the growing flock, and along the south fence the apple trees, now at height, thick with their first real crop, the fruit still small and slightly tart but unmistakably there. Gilbert picked the first apple from the first tree on an October morning in 1891 and brought it to Letitia where she was hanging the wash, and he held it out to her with the same gravity he had held out the wildflowers 4 years earlier, the gesture of a man who understands what things mean. She took it and bit into it. It was tart and sweet and a little imperfect, as first things often are. She said, "Thomas would have liked these trees." "Yes," Gilbert said, "he would have." She held the apple for a moment, looking at the trees, at the straight proud rows of them along the south fence, at the fruit hanging in the October light. She thought about Thomas and about herself at 28 standing in the cold with her hand on a fence post reading a name she did not know, and she thought about everything that had come from that, all the ordinary and extraordinary days that had assembled themselves into a life. She said, "Gilbert." He said, She turned and looked at him, her husband, this specific man who had spent a winter sleeping in a linta to keep a stranger safe, who had scratched his name into her fence post and tried to disappear and been found instead. She said, "I am very glad you could not ride away." He looked at her with the eyes she had come to know as well as she knew her own hands. He said, "I never could have. Not really, even before I understood why." She leaned up and kissed him in the apple orchard in the October light. He put his arms around her and held her close, and she felt the solid reality of him, the warmth and the weight of him, the specific shape of the life they had built together bone by bone, and season by season and choice by choice. Young Thomas came around the corner of the barn at that moment with Clara in tow, Clara being 2 and therefore more carried than walking, held against her brother's small chest with the determined competence of a child who has appointed himself responsible for something important. Thomas said with the practical clarity of a 3-year-old, "Papa, the chickens are fighting again." Gilbert stepped back from Letitia, his hand still at her waist, and turned to look at his son with the gravity the situation apparently required. He said, "Which ones?" Thomas said. "The big red one and the speckled one." "The speckled one provoked it," Gilbert said, as if this were established fact. "She always does." Letitia laughed. She could not help it. Gilbert looked at her with that expression, the almost smile that had become entirely a smile over the years, easy and warm. She said, "Go settle the chickens." "I will," he said. He kissed her temple as he passed her. "Save me that apple." She stood in the orchard with Clara making her way toward her across the grass with the single-minded determination of a toddler who has spotted her mother. And she watched Gilbert walk toward the chicken coop with Thomas on his heels, explaining the tactical situation in great detail. And the October light came down gold and warm on the whole scene, on the barn and the house and the fields and the trees, on everything they had built together on this piece of Kansas earth. She picked up Clara and settled her on her hip and walked back toward the house, and she thought about the name scratched into the fence post in the snow, the name she had touched with cold fingers on a March morning and then ridden 2 miles across the thawing prairie to find. She thought about how close she had come to never finding it, if the snow had melted faster, if she had taken a different path to the barn, if she had been the kind of person who saw a mystery and let it alone. She was not that kind of person. She had never been. Clara put her small hand flat against Letitia's cheek and said, with the earnest experimental quality of a child trying out a word, "Mama." Letitia pressed her face into her daughter's soft hair and breathed. "Yes," she said. "That is right. That is exactly right." The afternoon moved around them, the homestead settling into its October rhythms, the chickens apparently resolved by the time she reached the porch, Gilbert and Thomas coming back from the coop with the satisfied air of diplomats who have brokered a fragile peace, Thomas explaining his role in the resolution with considerable embellishment. She set Clara down on the porch steps and started on the supper, and Gilbert came in through the kitchen door and washed his hands at the basin and looked at the apple on the table where she had left it. He picked it up and turned it in his hands. He said, 4 more years before they are fully producing. Might get a full barrel out of the south end by 95. 95, she said. I will hold you to that. He set the apple down and leaned against the doorframe watching her work, the way he had that first morning when he had come in and sat at the table and held his hat in both hands. He was not holding his hat now. He was entirely at ease, entirely present, entirely here in the particular way that a man who has found the place he was supposed to be occupies a space with a quality that is almost visible. She said, without turning from the stove, "You are staring." "I am," he agreed. "Is there a reason?" "Several," he said. "I can list them if you like." She turned and looked at him over her shoulder. He was smiling. The real smile, the full one, the one she had been working to bring out since that first rusty laugh in October. She said, later, "Right now I need you to slice that apple and feed it to the children. Clara has been eyeing it since she came in." He pushed off the doorframe and picked up the apple and the knife, and she turned back to the stove. And behind her she heard him talking to the children, low and warm, Clara making urgent sounds of anticipation, Thomas explaining something at length, and the kitchen filling with the smell of supper and the sound of her family. She closed her eyes for one moment. Just one, just enough to take it in. Then she opened them and kept cooking. The apple trees bore 36 pounds of fruit in the fall of 1892 and 60 in 1893, and by 1895, exactly as Gilbert had predicted, a full barrel from the south end alone. They sold the surplus in Caldwell and put the money toward a proper root cellar addition with a stone floor. which Letitia had wanted since the second year. Clara Ruth began school in the fall of 1895, attending the small one-room schoolhouse that had opened 3 miles east, which she endured with patient contempt for the pace, and greeted every Friday afternoon with the relief of a person released from a minor captivity. She was bright in the way that produced both opportunity and difficulty, too quick for the curriculum and too confident to pretend otherwise. Thomas, at 7, had his father's quality of stillness and his mother's capacity for determined work, and he had already decided that the homestead was going to be his, and was proceeding with the matter of learning it as if it were an occupation. A third child came in 1893, a boy they named James, who was fair where his siblings were dark and easygoing where they were intense, and who arrived into the household with the equanimity of a person who has assessed the situation and found it acceptable. The homestead by 1895 was nothing like the one Letitia had stood in March of 1887, reading a name scratched into a fence post. It was a real working farm, 160 acres fully in use, with a wheat operation that ran clean and profitable, an apple orchard that was beginning to be spoken of in Caldwell as something worth having, a kitchen garden that produced more than the family needed and sent the surplus to town in season, and a household that ran with the particular smooth efficiency of 2 competent people who have found their working rhythm and stayed with it. Gilbert had long since stopped being a drifter in his own understanding of himself. The man who had camped in the cottonwoods and watched over a stranger's homestead from a careful distance had become, gradually and completely, and without any single moment of transformation that could be pointed to, a man rooted as deeply in a place as it was possible to be rooted, grown into the Kansas earth the way the apple trees had grown into it, slow and thorough and permanent. He was 35 when he came back in March of 1887. He was 43 now, and the gray at his temples had spread through his hair completely, and the lines at the corners of his eyes were deeper, and he was, Letitia thought with a love so established it had become like the land itself, something you stood on rather than something you fell into, the most thoroughly himself she had ever seen him. The question of crews came up only once more, in 1891, when a letter arrived for Gilbert from a lawyer in San Antonio. She watched him read it at the kitchen table, watched his face move through several things, and when he was done he set it down and said, "Cruz is dead. He died in '89. The man who bought my land in the debt sale is contesting the original transaction. There may be some money," she said. "What do you want to do?" he said. Right back to the lawyer, he looked at her. "This land is ours. Whatever comes from that is for the children." She held his gaze. The old wound was present in his face, not gone, not pretending to be gone, but contained within a life large enough to hold it without being defined by it. She said, "That is a good answer." There was in fact some money, not a great amount, the kind of settlement that comes out of contested frontier land deals, reduced by lawyers and time, and the general diminishment of things that pass through courts. Gilbert put it in the Caldwell Bank in an account under Thomas's name, a start on what the boy would need when he was grown. On a Sunday morning in October of 1895, Letitia and Gilbert stood together at the fence along the south edge of the property, the one he had first repaired in the winter she did not know he was there, and they looked at the apple trees in their full October glory, the fruit picked and stored, the leaves going gold and red, the long rows of them running clean and purposeful in the October light. He had his arm around her shoulders. She had her arm around his waist. The children were somewhere behind them, James chasing a grasshopper with more enthusiasm than technique, Clara reading under the big cottonwood, Thomas in the barn doing the evening chores with the seriousness of a boy who has already decided what his life is going to be. She said, "We should plant more, along the east fence." He said, "We should. More apples or plum?" "Both," he said. "If we plant them in spring they will be bearing by 1900. 1900. The new century, still 5 years away, already visible from here if you looked in the right direction. She leaned her head against his shoulder. He pulled her slightly closer. She said, Gilbert Bristol. Letitia Bristol, he said. Thank you for coming back. He pressed his lips to her hair. He said, thank you for riding after me. The October light moved across the orchard and the fields and the homestead and the Kansas plain stretching out in every direction, endless and patient, the same land that had asked everything of them and given everything back, and they stood in it together as the afternoon came down toward evening, and it was enough. It was, in fact, more than enough. It was everything.